Good morning, good day, or good evening, wherever you are. I recently looked at every single creature that could function as your commander, and this is the third part of a series where I share with you some of the commanders that awakened my curiosity, and hopefully yours as well. Black is perhaps the color best suited to stand alone, so a lot of the commanders I'm going to show you are actually very viable options. Today I have everything in store for you. A demon that makes fetchland users cry, Voltron commanders that straight up one-shot your opponents, and a spell-slinging samurai from Kamigawa. So, whether you listen to this while cooking, in your bed, or while playing Magic, get comfortable and enjoy. What better way to start a list made by me than with a spirit from, you guessed it, Kamigawa. Akuta Born of Ash costs 4 mana and is a 3/2 with haste. The ability reads as follows. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you have more cards in hand than each opponent, you may sacrifice a swamp. If you do, return Akuta Born of Ash from your graveyard to play. While this little fella probably doesn't make the cut as a commander, I can see him being a part of a value engine in maybe your Tiny Bones discard deck. But maybe you can figure out a way to turn it into a Voltron commander that just keeps coming back over and over again. Or you could pair it with the next commander, Ashnod Flesh Mechanist. Ashnod is a human artificer, so we are just continuing the trend we set in the Mono Blue video. It has Death Touch, which is nice for a 1-drop, and whenever Ashnod attacks, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, create a tap Power Stone token. Additionally, for 5 and exiling a creature from your graveyard, you get to create a tapped 3/3 colorless zombie artifact creature token. Ashnod could be a very interesting commander for a mono black ramp since it has a deck that already is supported by great lands like Cabal Coffers, Cabal Stronghold, and Nykthos. So you have a good mana base already, and now you can pair it with this sacrifice but also artifact theme, which also go hand in hand, and there's also lots of artifacts that benefit from being sacrificed that have recursion from the graveyard. So if you're looking for a fun commander that you can get out on the first turn every single game and start doing your commander thing, Ashnod is certainly something that could be of interest to you. Asmodeus the Archfiend is a 6 mana 6/6, which is very fitting for a Devil God. His ability is a bit tricky. If you would draw a card, exile the top card of your library face down instead. This is compensated by the fact that for 3 mana you get to draw 7, or rather you get to exile the top 7 cards of your library. Then for just 1 black mana, you get to return all cards exiled with Asmodeus to their owner's hand, and you lose that much life. Again, this one's a bit tricky. It follows this trend of black card advantage engines exiling the card first and then drawing the cards a bit delayed. Still, for just 4 mana, drawing 7 cards on what could be potentially your commander, that sounds pretty powerful to me. Balthor the Defiled is a zombie dwarf. It's a 4 mana 2/2, and the first ability can kind of be ignored because it gives all minions +1/+1. Minions isn't exactly an obsolete creature type, but it's very fringe, and since it's not really a go wide creature type, the +1/+1 really doesn't do anything for your game plan, but we consider Balthor because of his second ability. Because for 3 black mana, and removing Balthor from the game, each player gets to return all black and red creature cards from his or her graveyard to play. If you don't read this card carefully, you might think it's just Living End on a creature, but it's actually different because the devil's in the detail. For one, nobody actually has to sacrifice the creature on their board, which of course could be a downside or an upside depending on what the game state looks like. But since only red and black creatures are returned from graveyard to play, this means potentially only you will get to benefit from this effect, which is pretty crazy. While not many minions exist in Magic, the next commander is actually a human minion. It is Chainer Dementia Master. For just 5 mana, you get a 3/3 that gives all nightmares +1/+1. But just like with Balthor, we really only care about the second ability. Because again, for 3 black mana, and in this case, 3 life, you get to put target creature card from any graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. That creature is black and a nightmare in addition to its other creature types. To balance this incredibly strong effect, all nightmares are exiled once Chainer leaves the battlefield. This is definitely one of the stronger reanimate commanders, and trust me, there will be quite a few of these in this video, because you get to do it more than once a turn. You get to take creatures from any graveyard and you get to do it for just 3 black mana. Unlike many other reanimate commanders, the creatures you are getting are of course susceptible to just being exiled once Chainer leaves, but still this is a very strong effect. I believe the next card on this list was kind of a standard all-star. It's Drana, Liberator of Malakir. For 3 mana, you get a 2/3 vampire ally, it has flying first strike, and whenever Drana deals combat damage to a player, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on each attacking creature you control. Like so often, let's talk about creature types, because both vampire and allies are incredibly tribal focused. This means having a commander that has both creature types opens you up to play a lot of different cards if you so choose. Secondly, this is on the list because her ability is a bit more tricky than it seems at first. Since Drana has first strike, you get to put those +1/+1 counters on each attacking creature before most of them deal damage, unless they also have first strike, that is, and thus enable a nice way to go wide in mono black. I actually have a second iteration of Drana for you. Drana the Last Bloodchief is a 5 mana 4/4 vampire cleric, which is a different but still very relevant creature type, and it has flying. When Drana attacks, the defending player chooses a non-legendary creature in your graveyard, and you get to return that card to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it, and the creature becomes a vampire in addition to its other types. This combines the very popular vampire archetype with reanimation, which I think is pretty novel. Of course, if you just want to build the strongest vampire deck, there is a very clear choice of which commander you should pick. But if you're interested in maybe controlling your own graveyard and reanimating super powerful creatures, maybe teaming up with someone that will give you the card that you want, Drana is definitely a card you could choose. The first human wizard makes his appearance in the form of Endrek Sahr, Master Breeder. It's a 5 mana 2/2 that reads, whenever you cast a creature spell, create X 1/1 black Thrall creature tokens, where X is that spell's mana value. Should you control 7 or more Thralls, sacrifice Endrek. Since Endrek's ability is state-based, it will trigger immediately once you control 7 or more Thralls, but it won't trigger again once it's on the stack. This means, first of all, even if you have less than 7 Thralls when the ability resolves, you will still need to sacrifice them. Let's say you put all of those Thralls into an Ashnod's altar, you will still need to sacrifice Endrek. But on the flip side, you can maybe flash in some more creatures and get even more black Thralls out of the deal before Endrek goes to the command zone. Endrek really fascinates me because it seems very breakable to me. It pairs super well with a bunch of mechanics like Delve, like Affinity, like Emerge, and probably others that I can't think of right now. If you can think of any other mechanics that work really well with Endrek, please feel free to leave a comment down below. I always look forward to seeing your suggestions and what you came up with. Honestly, I don't even know where to begin with Fain the Broker, because this 3 mana 3/3 just does it all. He makes creatures, he sacrifices creatures. He distributes counters, he takes counters away. He makes artifacts and he sacrifices artifacts. And if you have a lot of mana, you just get to untap and do it all again. There's so many possibilities with Fain. It actually looks limitless. He's just trading post as your commander, which is great. Geth, Lord of the Vault, is a 6 mana 5/5 zombie with Intimidate, and one of the many black reanimators commander you'll see today. For 1 and X, you get to put target artifact or creature, with converted mana cost X, from an opponent's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control tapped. Then, that player puts the top X cards of his or her library into his graveyard. What I like about Geth is you cannot reanimate from your own graveyard, but instead have to rely on your opponent's graveyards. This means there's probably less consistency because you can't choose which artifacts and creatures your opponents put into their decks, but it probably also leads to a bigger variety in gameplay. Geth might not be the most powerful commander since you, again, can't really choose your reanimation targets, but it might be more refreshing to play mostly with your opponent's toys and not reanimate the same 2 to 3 creatures every single game. If that version of Geth is too slow and too inconsistent for you, I have another Geth in store for you. Geth, Thane of Contracts, is a 3 mana 3/4. It is not only a zombie, nope, he's also been Phyrexianized. His first ability gives all creatures you control -1/-1. Now that's not a very nice line to read at first, because it will mostly be a downside to your game plan. However, I want to point out that there are some cards that benefit from dying immediately, such as Mirror Retriever, who gets to return another target artifact from your graveyard should he die, and since it's a 1/1 it will always immediately die. This to me just goes and shows that even a downside like that could potentially become an upside if you just build your deck correctly. But even if we don't use the -1/-1 Geth provides, there's still the second ability, which reads, for 3 mana and tapping Geth, you get to return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains if this creature would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. Getting to reanimate targets consistently for just 3 mana is pretty insane. So many of the targets you are going to reanimate don't really care about being exiled should they ever die again, because they will already have provided you with immense amount of value. So really this might be one of the stronger reanimate commanders out there. Next on the list is Gorex the Tombshell, and he isn't tied for the most expensive commander on the list. In theory, you need to pay 8 mana for a 4/4 zombie turtle, but of course there's a way to get around this, because as an additional cost to cast a spell, you can exile any number of creature cards from your own graveyard, and each card you exiled this way makes it so Gorex costs 2 less. Gorex also has Death Touch, and whenever he attacks or dies, you get to choose a card at random that you exiled to pay for Gorex and put the card into your own hand. I really like commanders that can compensate for command attacks, so you can have them out and about more often than other people would be able to. Also, Gorex kind of works wonderfully with cards like Desecrated Tomb that care about cards leaving your graveyard, and should he stick around, he's a great way to generate some card advantage. Greel, Mindraker, comes from a different time of Magic when this card was not actually targeted but random instead. Have you ever been hit by a Mind Twist before? Yeah, this commander does the same thing, because for X and tap, and the admittedly high cost of discarding 2 cards, target player has to discard X amount of cards at random from his or her hand. In the mono white video, I've actually showcased the white equivalent of Greel, so be sure to check out that video as well. Let's talk about this ability. In mono black, as I've said before, you have great tools to produce truly immense amounts of mana, so that X really shouldn't be a problem. Discarding 2 cards, however, that kind of hurts most decks. But sometimes, let's just assume you run Reanimator, you might actually be interested in discarding some cards out of your hand. You definitely do need to find a way to make this ability somewhat sustainable, because the effect is very strong, but if you only activate it once, that doesn't really qualify it as a good commander. Even if X isn't the size of their entire hand, since the discard is random, it can very much destroy someone's game plan. And also, since it's not a sorcery speed ability, you can just lock someone out of playing the game forever and draw step make them discard the card they've just drawn for the turn. Sure, you might need to look for a new player after that game, but at least you had your fun, am I right? If you really want a challenge, you can try and build a deck around Haakon Stromgald Scourge, but typically I wouldn't recommend making it your commander and rather playing it in the 99, because this zombie knight can only be played from your graveyard but not from anywhere else. Should you manage to get him in play, he provides you with a really strong source of card advantage, because as long as he's in play, you get to play knight cards from your graveyard. Maybe you want to take your Sir Conrad deck into a slightly different direction than you usually do. Why not try and actually making it a mono black knight deck that uses Haakon to fairly replay all those knights you have milled into your graveyard? Horobi Death's Veil is one of those Kamigawa cards where they just decided to put some crazy text on it. This 4 mana 4/4 flying spirit reads as follows. Whenever a creature becomes the target of a spell or ability, destroy that creature. That could be any creature, any spell, any ability. Since this is a symmetrical effect, we need to break it. We could, for example, play indestructible creatures, or creatures that maybe come back because they have persist. Speaking of persist, if you happen to have a card like Cauldron of Souls that can target any number of creatures, Horobi makes it so you have a one-sided board wipe every single turn. You could also just not play any creatures and instead rely on casting instant and sorceries, or maybe enchantments to win the game. I think together with the next commander on this list, Horobi makes me think that there's actually a mono black spirit deck out there that could be very fun and even somewhat competitive. Because next on the list is Iname Death's Aspect, a 6 mana 4/4 spirit from what is potentially the best block of all time, Kamigawa. And I know I say this a lot in these videos that a commander is very unique in what it does, but in this case, I actually believe it could be true that this is factually unique. Because when Iname comes into play, you get to search your library for any number of spirit cards and put them into your graveyard. This has the potential to be game ending every single time you do it. You play Iname, you just get the biggest, baddest spirits in existence, and then cast a mass reanimation spell the following turn, and if there's no graveyard hate, you are definitely going to win that game. What's so exciting about this to me is also that Iname will just keep getting better and better, as better spirits are introduced to Magic. Right now, the best spirits you could reanimate are probably cards like Cryptghast, Midnight Banshee, or Pit Lord, but who knows what the next set might bring. I truly don't think there's any other card like this that lets you put just any number of creature cards in your graveyard. So even if you don't mass reanimate, there's probably some other neat trick that you could do with an effect like this. If you find anything interesting, let me know in the comments. Kiku, Knight's Flower, marks the third Kamigawa card in a row, but I promise she deserves a spot. For 2 black mana, you get a 1/1 Human Assassin that has the ability to, for 4 mana and tap, making target creature deal damage to itself equal to its power. First of all, I think it's a flavor win, right? She makes it so the shadows of her enemy fight against themselves. And secondly, what's interesting is that Kiku doesn't destroy, but rather the creature deals damage to itself. Therefore, there's probably some interesting shenanigans you can do with cards like Barbed Servitor, or maybe you even gift an opponent a Phyrexian Obliterator and then target it with Kiku's ability. Let's leave Japan and go to ancient Greece to pay King Macar, the Gold Cursed, a visit. He's a 4 mana 2/3 human with the Inspired ability. Inspired triggers every time something untaps. In King Macar's case, you get to exile target creature forever, not until end of turn, not until King Macar leaves the battlefield. No, you just get to exile any creature. And as if that weren't enough, you also get to make a treasure token. You can pair King Macar with vehicles, Springleaf Drums maybe, and other ways to tap things, as well as cards that untap creatures you control, to have a pretty efficient way of just machine gunning every creature on the board that also produces treasure tokens while you do it that could fuel engines like, let's say, Marionette Apprentices. Next on the list is Kinzu, the Bleak Coven, a 5 mana, 5/4, vampire with flying. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies, you may pay 2 life. If you do, exile it and create a token that's a copy of the creature, except it's a 1/1 and has Toxic 1. Kinzu sits in an interesting niche because she's kind of board wipe protection. She also provides great value, but she also works with poison counters. It is interesting to note that multiple instances of Toxic stack, so if you were to exile a dying Toxic creature that has Toxic 1, the token would have Toxic 2. I know Infect might not be the most popular mechanic, but in my opinion Kinzu is way more interesting than something like Skithiryx, that just one-shots your opponents and does nothing else. Because again, she fills multiple roles and works with different types of strategies. I have another commander for you that lets you steal other people's toys in Lim-Dûl the Necromancer. It's a 7 mana human wizard that can regenerate target zombie for 2 mana. How are we getting those zombies? Well, whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you get to pay 2 mana, and if you do, you get to return that creature onto the battlefield under your own control, and it's a zombie in addition to its other types. In comparison to Geth, you don't get to reanimate anything that is milled because the creature needs to die and then the triggered ability goes onto the stack. And you also don't get to reanimate artifacts. On the plus side, Lim's second ability naturally lends itself to be at the helm of a zombie deck because you can just use the second ability fairly to regenerate your own zombies over and over again. And should you manage to turn Lim into a zombie himself, you would get to regenerate Lim over and over again. So while at first glance, Geth might look more flexible and a bit stronger, I think Lim-Dûl definitely has a role to play and is still unique enough in his ability that he deserves a spot on the list. Just like in the Mono Blue video, Bloomburrow does make an entrance here on this list. With Maha, it's Feather's Knight. Maha is a 6/5 Flampler that has Ward, discard a card. Now, the stats and keywords already make this a super good card, but what really makes and breaks Maha is its ability. Maha makes it so creatures your opponents control have base toughness 1. This kind of effect is pretty unheard of and makes it so the many black cards that give opposing creatures -1/-1 relevant. You could pair Maha with cards like Make Obsolete, or even Massacre Worm to one-sidedly wipe the board. Or you could go as far as to play Kervik or Knights of Soul's Betrayal and pretty much immediately kill any creature your opponents would ever want to play. Maha also guarantees that a lot of creatures are going to die, so everything that profits from creatures dying can be run in your Maha deck. One of my all-time favorite blocks is and will always be Lorwyn. And Maraline of the Morn Song definitely does the set justice. It's a 3-mana 2/3 elf wizard that can fill different types of roles as your commander. Let's start from the top. Players can't draw cards. Well, that isn't exactly a line any playgroup wants to read, but don't worry, this is actually a group hug commander in disguise, because at the beginning of each player's draw step, instead of drawing, that player loses 3 life and gets to search the library for any card, put it in hand, and then shuffle. This makes it so as long as Maraline is on the battlefield, every single turn, every player gets to draw the best card in their deck. As I said, awesome group hug commander. Unless of course you were to drop an opposition agent on your opponents, but you would never do that, right? Making these videos, I've talked a lot about how assassins and rogue have gotten a lot more support, and finally I have a commander that proves my point. Mirri the Killing Quill is a 3-mana 3/2 vampire assassin. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, exile it with a hit counter on it. Also, assassins, mercenaries, and rogues you control have Death Touch. And whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, you may remove a hit counter from a card in exile. If you do, draw a card and create 2 treasure tokens. I will say that last sentence is really what pushes Mirri to be not just a good card, but a great card. Drawing cards is always nice, but creating 2 treasure tokens? 2 treasure tokens is so much mana. Massacre Girl made it on the list, and she brings back an old mechanic in the form of Wither. Wither makes it so whenever a creature you control deals damage to another creature, they do so in the form of -1/-1 counters. Also, whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, Massacre Girl will check if that creature's toughness was less than 1, and if it was, you get to draw a card. This card pairs really well with Maha from Bloomburrow, and just like Maha, it also pairs really well with anything that gives -X/-X, like the aforementioned Massacre Worm, among others. But you could also take her in a slightly different direction, because -1/-1 counters is a semi-supported archetype. It pairs really well with one of the most beloved mechanics, that is Proliferate, and thus I think it could definitely be a commander that is very fun to pilot. Next on the list is Mikaeos the Unhallowed, a 6-mana 5/5 zombie cleric that actually doesn't care about zombies all that much. It has Intimidate and randomly hates on humans because whenever a human deals damage to you, that human is destroyed. But randomly hating on humans isn't enough to put them on the list. It's really the third ability that we care about. The third ability gives all non-human creatures you control +1/+1 and Undying. Undying means, should a creature with Undying die, if it had no +1/+1 counters on it, return it to the battlefield under your control with a +1/+1 counter. You could play Mikaeos as some sort of value engine, where you sacrifice creatures and they come back, but really what I see, and maybe this is my spiky brain, is abusing the +1/+1 counters with stuff like Triskelion, or maybe a more recent example, Walking Ballista, where those cards immediately go infinite and kill all your opponents. But there is probably a fairer and nicer way out there to play Mikaeos, and if you have any suggestions on a fair value engine with Mikaeos, I'd love to hear it. Mirri the Cursed might be the first real Voltron commander on this list, and she's very straightforward, but I still wanted to give her a shout out. Mirri is a 3/2 vampire cat, and while I don't think cat is really something that you can bank on in mono black, vampire of course is super common and very beloved. Mirri has 3 relevant keywords: flying, first strike, and haste. Haste and flying are awesome keywords for a Voltron commander, but it gets even better because whenever Mirri deals combat damage to a creature, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on Mirri. So even if they do happen to have a flying creature or any other way to block Mirri, they get somewhat punished, and Mirri just gets to hit even harder the next time she attacks. I think if you really like vampires, but maybe you want to give your vampire deck a bit more of a Voltron style game plan, Mirri could be an interesting choice. Moira Urborg Haunt is a 3-mana 3/2 Spirit Wizard. She comes with Menace, and whenever she deals combat damage to a player, return to the battlefield target creature card that was put into that graveyard this turn. Moira also is kind of a Voltron commander. She does want those boots that were made for land walking. She also pairs really well with Sacrifice Outlets or cards like Grief that have Evoke, which means they die immediately after you've cast them for cheap. It's definitely an interesting spin, the whole theme, because those cards need to have been on the battlefield. You don't just get to reanimate anything, and you also need to hit. It's not just an activated ability. Next on the list is Nashi, Moon Sage Scion, 3-mana 3/2 Rat Ninja. And whenever I see the ninjutsu ability, my brain immediately thinks, oh, this couldn't be a commander. It has ninjutsu, which only works from hand. But I think Nashi is actually good enough to just make the cut as your commander. Because whenever Nashi deals combat damage to a player, you get to exile the top card of each player's library, and until end of turn, you may play one of those cards, but instead of paying mana, you get to pay with life. This feels a bit like a black Ragavan, where you hit someone, you exile the top card, and then you get to play it. Unlike Ragavan, Nashi will never run into the problem of not being able to cast the card you've hit. First of all, you get a wider selection because you get to exile 3 cards, but you also always get to cast a card because it costs life instead of mana. Very cool, very interesting, and maybe one of those cards that provides you with highlights that you will be able to tell stories about. Up next to this, Unshackled is a 6-mana 4/4 demon. It's a Flampler, and it comes with 2 abilities. Whenever another creature dies, put a +1/+1 counter on Upnixilis. This means Upnixilis becomes very big very fast. Combined with Flying and Trample, it makes for a solid Voltron commander. Maybe a bit more interestingly, whenever an opponent searches his or her library, that player sacrifices a creature and loses 10 life. 10 life is a lot. At first glance, these abilities seem to be bad design, because you cannot control if or when they happen. But actually, you can. If you pair up Nixilis Unshackled with cards like Field of Ruin or the aforementioned Marlene, you can actually force your opponent to search their library, which means they will take 10 and they will have to sacrifice a creature. Also, as a nice bonus, every fetch land becomes pretty much a dud. Patron of the Nezumi is a 7-mana 6/6 Spirit. It has Rat Offering, which means you can cast this card anytime by sacrificing a rat and paying the difference in mana cost between this and the rat. The ability is, whenever a permanent is put into an opponent's graveyard, that player loses 1 life. Now this is reminiscent of Sir Conrad, but unlike Sir Conrad, you can play this with Flash. You can play it for cheaper, and, most importantly, Patron of the Nezumi cares about permanents, not just creatures. So that means any land milled, any enchantment milled, any artifact milled, will cause your opponents to lose life. So, while it doesn't enable itself like Sir Conrad, the ability itself is a lot stronger. If you enjoy a deck building challenge or are maybe looking for good inclusions in your minion deck, you can play Phage the Untouchable. It costs 7 mana and is a 4/4. Whenever Phage the Untouchable enters the battlefield, if you didn't cast it from your hand, you lose the game. Oh, okay. So maybe only play this as your commander if you also plan on including cards that make it so you can't lose the game. What are we rewarded with for such an absurd line of text? Well, whenever Phage deals combat damage to a creature, destroy that creature. It can't be regenerated. But wait, there's more. Because when Phage deals combat damage to a player, that player loses the game. Oh wow, so just like Ragavan, she has Death Touch for players. But she has it for real. Playing Phage as a commander is something I want to do in my lifetime, but it's probably not very smart. Shaoku and Bringer is a 7-mana 5/5 flying vampire. It can't attack if there are any other creatures in play. Also during your upkeep, you lose 3 life. That's a pretty bad start. Let's look at the ability. If you tap Shaoku as an activated ability, you get to exile target creature and put a +1/+1 counter on Shaoku. This maybe isn't the strongest commander, but what caught my attention is how well this ability works in tandem with Illusionist's Bracers, which is an artifact that doubles up activated abilities, So Xiaoku will just sit there on the battlefield and repeatedly kill stuff until it grows and grows in size, and at one point it will be the only creature on the battlefield. And then I feel like it has the potential to just kill someone in 2 to 3 hits. The next one is an exciting one. It's Shirei Shizo's Caretaker, a 5 mana 2/2 spirit. So pretty abysmal stats, but it makes up for it with a super strong ability. Whenever a creature with power 1 or less is put into your graveyard from the battlefield, you may return that card to the battlefield at the beginning of the next end step as long as Shirei is still on the battlefield. It is worth noting that Shizo only cares about the creature's strength when it dies, not when it's in a graveyard. It's also important that since this is a delay trigger, Shizo does need to see the creatures die, so you can't just sacrifice everything, play Shirei after, and get those creatures back. But still, you could pair this with self-sacrificing one attack creatures like Hope of Girapur to make it so one player almost never gets to cast any spells. Even if Hope of Girapur doesn't sound interesting to you, I can guarantee you there's so many power 1 or less creatures in mono black that you will find something that you think is super interesting. Tergrid, God of Fright, is one of those Kaldheim gods that have a front and a backside. It's a 5 mana 4/5 with Menace on the front. And we really care mostly about this second paragraph of text on the front side, because whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent or discards a permanent card, you may put that card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. Wowee! This is crazy. We've seen effects that whenever an opponent sacrifices a non-token permanent, you get it instead. But paired with the fact that you can play a discard spell, take the best card and put it into play under your control, and it gets even better because if you make them discard lands, you get to put those lands onto the battlefield under your control. Tergrid makes for a truly menacing commander in a discard or sacrifice type deck. And this duality really makes this card so interesting to me because you can take it in different directions and all of them are good and interesting. Next is the Haunt of Hightower, a 6 mana 3/3 vampire that of course has flying, but it also comes with lifelink. Whenever Haunt attacks, the defending player needs to discard a card. And whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on Haunt. The easiest way to get cards into opponents' graveyards is of course milling, so this pairs really well with the mill package. Just imagine you play this on turn 6, and then the turn after you play Breach the Multiverse, milling everyone for 10, putting 30 +1/+1 counters on Haunt of Hightower, and one-shotting one opponent after the other. Next on the list is another 1 mana commander. It's Tiny Bones, the Pickpocket. This cutie has Death Touch, which is nice on a 1-drop, and whenever Tiny Bones the Pickpocket deals combat damage to a player, you may cast target non-land permanent card from that player's graveyard and use any type of mana to cast that spell. It feels a bit like Black's version of Ragavan, and really what I love about this is that it's 1 mana. The effect of course is almost tame, but when you have a 1 mana commander, you can kind of build your deck around it very safely, because you can expect to have that commander every single game and almost every single turn of that game. Hey, even if someone Swords to Plowshares Tiny Bones, it's 1 mana for 1 mana, and you get to replay it for just 3. Cards like this give me confidence that I can make everything about their ability and reliably have that ability at disposal. Usually, when you think of life gain matters, you think of white. But actually, black has a lot of tools that make life matters a viable archetype. One of those tools is Tivish, Gloom Summoner. It's a 5 mana 4/4 human warlock with lifelink. At the beginning of your end step, should you have gained life this turn, you may pay that amount of life. If you do, you get to create an XX black demon creature token with flying. As I've said, mono black life gain has great support. There's cards like Sanguine Bond or Veto, which work wonderfully with just the theme of Tivash, right? Gaining life. But you can also make great use of the tokens you get by sacrificing them to Disciple of Bolas. Or heck, maybe you leave those huge 18/18 tokens on the battlefield and play Essence Harvest to dome someone for 13 and gain the same amount of life. I think Tivash is so interesting because life kind of has diminishing returns. Whether you have 60 life or 1120 kind of doesn't really make a difference, but if you get to turn that life into a resource, namely creatures on the board, you do something different than many mono white decks do. If you are of the opinion that burn is nerfed too much in Commander because everyone has 40 starting life total and there's 3 opponents, look no further than Torgar. Torgar is an 8 mana 7/6, which doesn't look like a burn card or really any aggressive card, but as you cast a spell, you get to sacrifice any number of creatures. Torgar will cost 2 less for each creature sacrificed this way. So, in a way, you get to play this cheaper and you also get to battle commander decks. And when this card enters the battlefield, up to one target player's life total becomes half their starting life total. So in a commander game, this usually means they go from their full 40 down to 20. If you manage to cast it 3 times, you can reduce the life total of each opponent to 20, which will really make those commander games faster. What's even more interesting is if you've played Hearthstone, there is a card that would set a player's life total to 15. And even though most of the time it would be used offensively to kill an opponent quicker, sometimes you could use it defensively. And Torgar is just the same. Should you be at 1 HP because maybe you paid a bunch of life and comboed off, you can use Torgar to go back to 20, healing yourself for up to 19 life, and maybe use that life as a resource again. Potentially my favorite card on this list is Toshiro Umezawa, a 3 mana 2/2 human samurai that comes with the legendary and absurdly good ability Bushido 1. Let's not talk about it. Whenever you sit down across someone and they play a 2/2 human samurai with Bushido, you would expect them to care about attacking and blocking, combat, fair and fun things. But really, Toshiro's ability lends itself to incredibly degenerate stuff. Because whenever a creature an opponent controls is put into a graveyard from play, you get to play target instant card from your graveyard and have to exile it should you choose to play it. So really what I thought about when I saw this card was Storming Off. Black has access to maybe the best rituals in all of Magic, and those are all instants. Black also has access to the best kill spells. Now all you need is a finisher. And yes, Tendrils of Agony is a sorcery, so it can't really be your finisher in your combo, but if you've cast a bunch of Dark Rituals, because you've cast a bunch of Malicious Afflictions first, and then you play Rise of the Dread Marn, that should be a pretty sick combo turn. These kinds of cards that break expectations and make someone go, wait, what? What does this do? Those are my favorite kinds of cards. We're going back to Kaldheim with Varragoth Bloodsky Sire. It's a 3 mana 2/3 demon rogue. It has Death Touch and the Boast ability, which means you need to attack and then at any time during your turn you get to activate it. In this case for 2 mana. Should you choose to activate the Boast ability, target player searches the library for any card, shuffles the library and then puts the card on top of it. Now, the first instinct is of course to just attack and target yourself, tutoring your own library and getting the best card for yourself. But there could be reasons to target your opponents. Let's say you play Obnixilis Unshackled. Or let's say you just want to have a nice group hug commander. Just ask someone, do you want to take 2? I'll target you and you'll get to tutor the best card from your library. Maybe you even play this with Opposition Agent, but you wouldn't do that, would you? When people first start playing Commander, you will have to teach them about this obscure rule called Commander Damage, which says, should any player take 21 damage from a single commander over the course of the game, they immediately lose the game. And this ability, I feel like, was made exactly for Volrath the Fallen. This 6 mana 6/4 Phyrexian Shapeshifter gets to pay 2 mana and discard a card from your hand. Should you do, Volrath gets +X/+X, where X is the discarded creature's converted mana cost. It's very straightforward what you want to do, because did you know that 6 + 15 is 21? Just discard that Draco, or Shadow of Mortality, and one-shot an opponent. Black has many ways to get those out of the graveyard back into your hand. Just do it again next turn. 21, 21, 21, the game is won. The second to last commander on this list is the last Reanimator commander. It's Whisper Blood Liturgist. For 4 mana you get a 2/2 human cleric. For just tapping and sacrificing 2 creatures, you get to return target creature from your graveyard to the battlefield. It is important to note that the creatures you sacrifice to activate can't be the target of the ability, so you can't sacrifice something and immediately bring it back. What differentiates Whisper from the other reanimators we've seen so far is that it relies on having a lot of creatures on your board. You want to pair this with tokens and with creatures that do something when they die. This, to me, paired with the fact that it's 4 mana, makes it one of the better ones on the list. The last entry on the list will be a Voltron commander though. It's Yahenni, the Undying Partisan. For just 3 mana, you get a 2/2 with haste. Similar to Mirri, this creature grows stronger over the course of the game, because whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on it. Lastly, you can sacrifice another creature to give Yahenni indestructible until end of turn. This fulfills so many qualities I'm looking for in a Voltron commander. It's cheap, it has haste, which is premium, it grows stronger, and it's protected from kill spells and board wipes. Heck, board wipes are even beneficial. You can play Yahenni on turn 3 and attack. On turn 4, you sacrifice a creature and just play Damnation, killing every other creature, pumping this for potentially +6, +7, whatever, and then hitting someone. Yahenni, definitely one of the better Voltron commanders in Mono Black, and it looks very fun with this sacrifice sub-theme built in. And thus the list has concluded. If you're looking forward to the other colors, I will be going through them in order of the color pie, so Mono Red will be next. Since I'm not a YouTuber, however, these videos will kinda just come out whenever I can get them done. If you don't wanna miss them, feel free to subscribe. In the meantime, you can check out the other parts, but most importantly, be nice to yourself and others. Enjoy your day, everyone.